By the start of 1996, the PlayStation had survived the hardest part. People knew what it was, people wanted one, developers were arriving, and games were getting bigger, and for the first time, millions of people weren't looking at the PlayStation in magazines anymore, they were actually using it. That's usually the moment technology gets less romantic, because there's a big difference between launching a machine and living with one. And this is where something strange started happening. PlayStations started getting sick. Not all at once, not dramatically, just little things at first. A game takes longer to load, music skips, a loading screen hangs for slightly too long, you reset the console, it works, then it happens again. Then one day, nothing. The disc spins, the startup appears, then silence. No game, no explanation, just that horrible feeling that somehow your expensive future had stopped being futuristic. What players were discovering was something Sony never advertised and most people never thought about: heat. Those early PlayStations were doing a lot of work. Compact discs spinning constantly, optical lasers reading data, power supplies sitting inside relatively compact plastic shells. Most of the time, everything behaved exactly as expected, until it didn't. Over time, heat inside some early units could start affecting the optical assembly and the reliability of disc reading. Most players never knew the engineering behind it, and honestly, they didn't care. All they knew was yesterday the machine worked, today it didn't. And this is where one of the great unofficial rituals of 90s gaming appeared: turn it upside down. That was the advice. No manuals, no official support page, just school playground engineering. Flip the console, try again, maybe put something underneath it, maybe let it cool down, maybe open the lid and close it again. Everybody seemed to know somebody who knew somebody whose PlayStation only worked upside down, and the ridiculous thing, sometimes it worked. Looking back now, it sounds completely absurd. Imagine buying a television today and being told the repair method is rotating it and hoping gravity gets involved. But back then, people just accepted it. That's what makes this period interesting. Players weren't consumers yet, they were participants. People expected technology to be slightly temperamental. You hit things, blew into cartridges, adjusted aerials, untangled wires, and apparently sometimes turned your console upside down and carried on. Sony noticed, quietly. You won't find dramatic public apologies or giant recalls because that isn't really how the industry operated then. Instead, revisions started appearing, internal layouts changed, manufacturing improved, reliability became more important. Sony started learning a lesson that would follow the company for years. People forgive problems, they don't forgive being ignored. And underneath all of this, something bigger was happening. The PlayStation had crossed the line. It wasn't exciting new hardware anymore. Now it was part of everyday life. People were building routines around it, buying memory cards, renting games, planning weekends, arguing over who got the television. And once a machine becomes part of daily life, people stop treating flaws as reasons to leave. They start finding ways to live with them. 1996 would become a year of huge ideas, bigger games, and moments that changed the industry. But first, the future needed to cool down.
Here we have a fellow who's been experimenting with PlayStation for only a few minutes. Proof that we saps must be on our guard. Remember, do not underestimate the power of PlayStation.
Welcome to the definitive history of the Sony PlayStation. I'm Parasine. By 1996, something interesting had happened. The first wave of PlayStation games had mostly been trying to prove things. Look how fast this moves, look how many polygons we can draw, look how close this feels to the arcade. Everything felt slightly louder than necessary because the industry was still introducing itself to 3 dimensions. But eventually, showing off stops being enough. Once people get used to the technology, they start wanting something else. Feeling. That's where things started changing. Because while most of the industry was still chasing speed and spectacle, Capcom released something that moved in the opposite direction.
Resident Evil.
And the strange thing is, if you go back and actually explain Resident Evil to someone who never played it, parts of it sound terrible. Slow movement, fixed camera angles, limited ammunition, doors that take forever to open, characters who occasionally sounded like they'd met each other 5 minutes before recording. On paper, it sounds frustrating. In practice, it felt different. Because Resident Evil understood something before most games did. Fear isn't created by showing everything, fear is created by limiting things. You couldn't freely look around, you couldn't see every corner, you didn't know what was in the next room until you physically walked into it. And once you stepped forward, the camera changed. Suddenly, what felt safe didn't feel safe anymore. That sounds obvious now, because games borrowed from this years afterwards. But in 1996, it felt unusual. Games usually made you feel powerful. Resident Evil made you feel uncertain, and uncertainty changes how people play. People moved slower, checked corners, saved ammunition, actually fought before opening doors. That wasn't normal. What Capcom accidentally discovered was that technical limitations could become design. The PlayStation couldn't render enormous detailed spaces in real time the way people imagined the future would work, so instead, the environments became fixed, pre-built, carefully framed, and instead of feeling limited, it felt cinematic. Rooms looked richer, lighting looked better, the world felt more believable, players stopped noticing the trick, they just remembered the feeling, and this reached further than horror, because suddenly developers started thinking differently. Maybe realism wasn't the goal, maybe atmosphere mattered, maybe controlling the player's emotions mattered, maybe games didn't need to constantly entertain every second. That shift quietly changed everything, and it wasn't only the horror, it was the audience too. People started showing PlayStation games to people who didn't normally care about games. Parents, friends, people who thought games were still jumping on platforms and collecting fruit. Because this felt older, not adult in the exaggerated marketing sense, just more confident. Like games no longer needed permission to take themselves seriously. And looking back now, that might be what Resident Evil really changed. It didn't prove horror worked, it proved games could create mood. Once players felt that, they started expecting more than entertainment, they started expecting experiences. And once expectation appears, there's no putting it back in the box. One of the funny things about early 3D games is that modern players usually assumed people understood them immediately. We didn't. That sounds ridiculous now, because moving through three-dimensional spaces feels completely natural. You pick up a controller, move a stick, and your brain quietly fills in the rest. But in 1996, that language didn't exist yet. Nobody had agreed on anything. Not cameras, not movement, not aiming, not jumping, not even which direction forward was supposed to be. Developers had spent years making games where movement was simple. Left, right, up, down. You pressed the direction and your character obeyed. Everything understood this rule. Then polygons arrived and suddenly games started asking strange questions. What happens if the player pushes forward but the camera changes? What if jumping happens towards the screen instead of across it? What if a player wants to walk slowly? What if turning takes time? Nobody knew. And because nobody knew, every game started inventing its own answers. That's why 1996 feels so unusual to go back to. Games don't just look different, they think differently. Resident Evil used what later became known as tank controls. Push forward and the character moves in the direction they're facing. Turn left, turn right, commit to movement. Now people argue about these controls today, but back then, they actually made sense. The camera kept changing. If movement changed with every angle, players would completely lose orientation, so Capcom traded speed for consistency. Then games like Tomb Raider took a similar idea and built entire worlds around precision. Suddenly, players were lining up jumps, counting steps and rotating in place before moving. That sounds clumsy now. Back then, it felt deliberate. Then you had something like Jump and Flash, which looked like somebody had built a first-person platform game and politely ignored the possibility that humans might become motion sick. It shouldn't really work, but it does, because everybody was experimenting. Then games like Kingsfield arrived and movement slowed down even further. Turning became heavier, looking became deliberate, exploration started replacing reaction speed, and underneath all of this sat one quiet problem: the controller. There were no analog sticks, no smooth movement, no gentle adjustments, everything came through a D-pad, every turn, every step, every jump, digital. People forget how strange that was. Entire worlds were being explored with technology originally designed around moving across flat screens. So players adapted. You learned, you stopped expecting games to behave like real life, you developed little rituals, tiny corrections, tap left, adjust, tap forward, line up, commit, miss, try again. And because everybody was learning together, nobody really questioned it. If a game controlled differently, you learned the game, that was normal. This becomes one of those moments where hindsight lies to us. We remember 1996 as the beginning of modern gaming, but honestly, it felt more like the Wild West. Nobody had written the rules yet, developers were inventing movement one release at a time, players were retraining their brains, and every awkward camera angle and weird control scheme was secretly answering a question the industry had never had to ask before. How do humans exist inside games? That answer was still years away, but in 1996, everybody started looking for it.
Friends, worried about what to get the kids for Christmas.
Well, worry no more. Get them stick.
It's not too thin, it's not too thick, it's stick, stick, stick. It's covered in bark, it's such a lark, it's stick, stick, stick. Stickity, stickity, stick. It's brown and sticky, it's stick. Stickity, stickity, stick. You'll get a kick out of stick.
So give them stick. Better that than they get PlayStation. Remember, Saps, do not underestimate the power of PlayStation.
By the middle of 1996, something slightly awkward had started becoming obvious. The PlayStation had become more powerful than its own habits. Games were changing, players were changing, but the hardware people were actually holding in their hands still mostly belonged to a different era. The original controller was good, really good, simple shape, comfortable, responsive, perfect for racing games, fighters, and everything that still fought in straight lines. But now games were asking players to move through spaces instead of across them. And suddenly, the old answers didn't always fit. Sony noticed, which is interesting because this is one of the first moments where PlayStation stopped behaving like a console and started behaving more like a platform. Instead of waiting for a completely new machine, Sony started experimenting. One of the strangest examples was the analog stick. If you'd never seen one, imagine somebody looked at a normal controller and decided comfort had become optional. Two large sticks, big handles, flight simulator energy, more expensive, more intimidating. It looked less like something for the sofa and more like equipment. And honestly, people didn't really know what to make of it. But underneath the strange shape was an important idea. Movement didn't need to be on or off anymore. You could push gently, turn gradually, adjust, move with intention. That sounds completely normal now. At the time, that idea was quietly revolutionary. Sony hadn't solved the problem yet, but they'd just recognised the problem existed. And once hardware companies start redesigning controls, that usually means something bigger is happening. But the experimentation didn't stop there, because while players were still trying to work out movement, Sony also started asking another question. What if one console wasn't enough? That sounds ridiculous now, but in 1996, multiplayer still mostly meant sharing one television and politely pretending not to look at somebody else's screen. Then the link cable appeared, and suddenly, things got strange. 2 PlayStations, 2 televisions, 2 copies of a game, 1 cable, connect them together, and now each player has their own screen. No split screen, no smaller image, no compromise. For a brief moment, this felt absurdly futuristic. Not practical and not cheap, definitely not convenient, but futuristic. And if you actually had access to one of these setups in the 90s, there's a good chance you never forgot it. 2 televisions humming next to each other, controls everywhere. Parents suddenly wondering why the electric bill suddenly mattered. Games suddenly feeling bigger than they should. Titles like WipEout XL and Doom suddenly stopped feeling like home versions pretending to be something else. They felt professional, almost excessive, which made them unforgettable. Most people never own these peripherals. That's important. That wasn't mainstream. But that's not really the point. The point is that Sony was saying the PlayStation wasn't finished, it wasn't a closed box, it was something developers and players could keep pushing, try new inputs, try new setups, try things that sounded unnecessary until one day they became standard. And looking back, that's probably what made this period so exciting. Nobody knew what would survive. Some ideas disappeared, some became normal, but for a while in 1996, the future still felt experimental.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here.
Check it out. What do you think about that?
We got real time, 3D, lush organic environments. How's that make you feel, buddy?
Feel a little like your days are numbered?
By 1996, 3 dimensions still felt slightly suspicious. Everybody wanted 3D, nobody completely understood it. That sounds unfair now, because we've spent decades refining movement, cameras and level design into something that feels invisible. But back then, developers were trying to solve problems nobody had ever had before, and platformers turned out to be one of the hardest. Because in 2 dimensions, the rules were obvious. See obstacle, jump obstacle, move right, simple. You always knew where you were, you always knew where you were landing. Then 3D arrived and suddenly death became real. Now jumps had distance, cameras moved, objects blocked your view, and players discovered something uncomfortable. People are actually quite bad at judging digital space. So developers started experimenting. Some games opened huge areas, some slowed movement down, some tried fixed cameras, some tried freedom. Nobody had the answer. Then Naughty Dog arrived with an approach that feels obvious now, but at the time was surprisingly clever. Don't fight the player, guard them. That became Crash Bandicoot. And one of my favourite things about Crash is that people remember it as a loud cartoon mascot game, when underneath it all, it was quietly one of the smartest technical games of the generation. Because Crash isn't really open, it feels open. That's different. Instead of giving players huge spaces and asking them to manage cameras and movement all at once, Naughty Dog narrowed the experience. Forward, backward, occasionally sideways, structured paths, controlled views. Suddenly, death became manageable. Players stopped getting lost, jumps started feeling predictable, movement felt cleaner, and because the camera was mostly controlled, the team could push visual detail much further than people expected. That mattered, because Crash looked expensive. Bright colours, dense environments, smooth animation, huge character expressions. People looked at screenshots and assumed the hardware had become more powerful. It hadn't. Developers had become smarter. And underneath all of this was the quiet revolution of the era: streaming. The PlayStation didn't have endless memory, not even close, so games started loading constantly in ways people never noticed. As you moved, the world moved. Parts disappeared, new parts arrived. Developers stopped building levels, they started building illusions. That sounds negative. It isn't. That's game design. You guide attention, hide limits, create the feeling of something bigger than the machine can actually hold. Crash understood that, but more importantly, players understood it. For the first time, people stopped treating 3D like a novelty. They started expecting it. That's the moment things changed. Because once people stop being impressed by polygons, developers have to start making better games, and Crash arrived exactly at the right moment. Not as the first platform game, not as the most technically impossible, but as one of the first that made 3 dimensions feel comfortable. That matters, because before this, 3D felt experimental. After this, it started feeling normal, and once something becomes normal, people immediately start wanting a mascot to go with it.
Feldman, Joseph J.
Feldman, Joseph J. According to my research, you're in the market for a new game system.
Are you aware, Mr. Feldman, that Sony's PlayStation has more than 150 games?
NHL Face-Off 97, Jet Moto, Tobal number 1, Destruction Derby 2, Crash Bandicoot.
I could go on. I'm going to give you a personal demonstration. Get off my lawn, you freak.
By late 1996, the PlayStation had a strange problem. It had the hardware, it had the developers, it had the sales, it even had the reputation, but it didn't really have a face. That probably sounds ridiculous now, because PlayStation eventually became the machine that almost didn't need mascots. The brand became strong enough that people followed games instead of characters. But in the mid-90s, this wasn't normal. Mascots mattered. Nintendo had Mario and Sega had Sonic. Those characters weren't just game characters, they were identity. You could recognise them instantly. They appeared in adverts, on lunchboxes, in magazines, on school bags. Entire companies quietly started becoming associated with one smiling face. Sony didn't have that, and at first, they didn't seem too worried. Their early strategy had been different: technology, attitude, music and variety. But eventually, somebody inside Sony must have looked around and realised something uncomfortable. People still wanted somebody to point at. Enter Crash Bandicoot, and one of the funny things about Crash is that he doesn't really feel like a PlayStation mascot when you first look at him. He isn't cool in the same way Sonic tried to be. He isn't timeless in the way Mario felt. He's weird, orange, slightly irritating, constantly spinning into things. But maybe that's exactly why he worked, because Crash wasn't designed to replace Mario. He was designed to feel different from Mario. Naughty Dog and Universal leaned into that. The adverts started appearing, the attitude got sharper, the messaging changed. There was less of the family entertainment feeling and more of this strange confidence that the PlayStation had been building for 2 years. And suddenly, the mascot war started looking different. Nintendo still felt polished and established. Sony started feeling louder, less respectful, more willing to poke fun. There's one thing I think gets misunderstood about this period though. Sony weren't trying to build a single hero, they were building an identity through variety. Crash mattered, but so did Lara, so did Resident Evil, and so did WipEout. PlayStation's real mascot wasn't one character, it was the feeling that this machine had room for all of them. That ended up becoming one of Sony's smartest accidental decisions, because if your identity depends on one character, that character eventually gets tired. If your personality depends on possibility, people keep showing up. In 1996, none of that was obvious. At the time, people saw Crash and thought something much simpler. Sony finally had one. Magazine covers changed, advertising changed, and people started associating games with platforms again. You didn't just own a PlayStation, you owned the machine with Crash on it, and once a machine gets a face, it stops feeling like technology and it starts feeling like culture. But while players were arguing over mascots, developers had quietly discovered something even bigger. The discs still had space left, and nobody quite knew what to do with it.
Hey, time to load up on PlayStation games. Greatest hits are on sale.
Crash Bandicoot, Jet Moto.
But I don't even have a PlayStation.
You do now.
Mom know about this?
By the second half of 1996, developers had started solving movement. Players were getting used to cameras, three-dimensional spaces were becoming easier to understand, and once those problems started calming down, a bigger question appeared. If we can finally build worlds, what do we actually put inside them? That sounds obvious now, but early 3D games had mostly been focused on proving the technology worked. Move, jump, race, fight, show off. Tomb Raider arrived and quietly asked something different. What if games became places? That probably sounds dramatic until you go back and look at what people actually experienced at the time. Because Tomb Raider doesn't really begin with action, it begins with space. You appear, you look around, and you look at where you are, and then you move. That rhythm mattered. Developed by core design in Derby, Tomb Raider felt different almost immediately because it wasn't trying to throw players through a corridor at speed. It wanted players to stop, observe and experiment, even get lost, and getting lost mattered. That's one of those feelings people don't talk about enough anymore. Before guides, before maps on second screens, before objective markers everywhere, getting lost was part of the experience. You climbed something because it looked climbable, you jumped because maybe it worked, you reached a new area and genuinely had no idea what was waiting. And suddenly, games started feeling larger than their physical size. Technically, Tomb Raider wasn't building unlimited worlds. It couldn't. The PlayStation still had tiny amounts of memory by modern standards, but clever design changed perception. Large rooms, vertical spaces, bigger distances, echoes, silence. You didn't remember measurements, you remembered scale. And then there was Lara, which is interesting because looking back, people often reduce Lara Croft to marketing. That happened later. In 1996, what made Lara stand out wasn't celebrity, it was presence. She wasn't a mascot, she wasn't constantly talking, she wasn't trying to be funny every 30 seconds. She felt capable, independent, a character who existed inside the world instead of performing for the player. That felt unusual, and players responded. Suddenly, games started appearing outside game magazines. People who normally ignored games started recognising characters. Not because graphics became realistic, because games had started feeling cinematic. That's another important shift. Tomb Raider didn't feel like an arcade machine, it felt closer to adventure films. It had slow movement, atmosphere, exploration. You weren't chasing scores anymore, you were somewhere, and maybe that's the bigger story of 1996. Technology had stopped being the event. People weren't buying games to see polygons, they were buying games to feel curiosity, mystery, scale. The machine had crossed another line. It wasn't enough to move through worlds anymore. Now players expected worlds worth moving through, and once developers realised people would follow atmosphere, they started looking at all that empty space sitting on the disc, because suddenly 650 megabytes didn't feel that large anymore. By late 1996, something strange had started happening. Developers were running out of ideas before they were running out of storage. That sounds impossible now, but for years, games had been designed around limits. How many sprites can fit? How much music can we keep? Can we afford another level? And can we save this animation? Entire generations had grown up making games by removing things. Then compact discs arrived and quietly changed the mood. Not overnight, but by 1996, developers started understanding what they actually had. Around 650 megabytes. Today, that sounds microscopic. Back then, it felt endless. And once people think something is endless, they immediately start getting ambitious. You can see it everywhere in 1996. Music changes, voice acting appearing more often, opening movies became larger, menus became cleaner, and games stopped feeling like software and started feeling like productions. Developers suddenly started asking dangerous questions. What if we recorded real audio? What if characters talked? What if the intro looked like a film? What if loading screens became transitions instead of interruptions? Nobody had all the answers yet, but experimentation exploded. Resident Evil became one of the clearest examples. Not because the voice acting was incredible, history has probably been kinder to some of those performances than they deserve, but because the game felt bigger than gameplay. Opening sequences, atmosphere, and audio, moments where the machine stopped feeling like a machine. Then games like Tekken 2 started treating introductions differently too. Suddenly, arcade ports weren't arriving alone. Now they came with animated openings, unlockables, and extras. Owning a game started feeling different from simply accessing it. And Tomb Raider used the space differently again. Music became selective, silence became deliberate. Atmosphere suddenly mattered as much as mechanics. And then there was Crash, which is funny because Crash almost pushed the opposite direction. Instead of filling discs with endless video and audio, Naughty Dog used space to create richer environments, smoother transitions, and denser worlds. That's what makes 1996 interesting. Nobody agreed what all this storage should actually be used for. Some developers treated discs like cinemas, some treated them like music albums, some treated them like giant memory cards, and occasionally, people treated them like a challenge to fit absolutely everything they could onto one single disc. Not every experiment aged well. This is where gaming starts discovering FMV overload. They had long intros, compressed video, characters talking because technology finally allowed them to, not because anybody had asked. You can feel developers learning in real time. More isn't automatically better, but that experimentation mattered because it changed expectations. Players started expecting openings, expecting music, expecting atmosphere, expecting games to feel larger than the hardware sitting underneath them. And that expectation becomes important because somewhere in the background, another group of developers started paying attention. watching all this disc space, watching bigger productions, thinking, what if one disc isn't enough? That question was already moving quietly towards 1997, but in 1996 the industry was still opening the box and trying everything inside. By the end of 1996, the PlayStation didn't feel new anymore. That probably sounds strange because the machine was barely 2 years old in Japan and only about a year old in parts of the West. But technology moved different then. Consoles arrived, changed everything for a few months, and suddenly people expected them to behave like permanent furniture. And the PlayStation had reached that moment. People weren't buying a curiosity anymore, they were buying the family console. The birthday present, the Christmas machine, the thing that was going to sit under the television for years, which meant Sony suddenly had a different responsibility. Stop proving it works and start proving it lasts. That shift happened quietly. No big relaunch, no giant marketing campaign, just thousands of tiny decisions happening inside factories and engineering meetings while players were busy arguing over games. Because underneath the shell, the PlayStation had already started changing. Sony had learned a lot since launch. They'd learnt where heat built up, they'd learnt what failed, and they'd learnt what cost too much, and most importantly, they'd learnt where people never noticed. So revisions started appearing, motherboards became cleaner, internal layouts improved, and components became easier to manufacture, parts became cheaper, not because Sony wanted to make a different machine, because they wanted to make the same machine more reliable. That decision matters. There's this idea that hardware revisions are admissions of failure. Usually they're admissions of success. You only optimise products you expect to keep selling, and Sony expected this machine to stay. The most obvious changes happened internally. Cooling improved, drive reliability improved, production became more efficient, and consoles became easier to assemble. But there was another change happening too. Confidence. That's harder to measure. Early PlayStation felt experimental. By 1996, Sony started behaving like a company that understood games. Supply came steadier, regional launches became smoother, and relationships with publishers became stronger. The machine stopped feeling like a project and started feeling like infrastructure. Even small details reflected that. Controllers evolved and manufacturing consistency improved. The packaging became more familiar and retail confidence increased. The PlayStation stopped feeling like something people were taking a chance on, and now it felt expected. And there's something slightly sad about that, because early hardware always has this weird energy. Launch models feel dangerous and unfinished, full of strange quirks and ideas. Revisions make things easier, but they also make them normal. That's the trade. The upside down console stories slowly disappear. People stop talking about whether the machine works, and they start talking about what they're playing. Which honestly, is exactly what Sony wanted, because that's how you know a platform has survived. People stop noticing the hardware, and once players stop thinking about the machine, developers suddenly get centre stage. By the end of 1996, the PlayStation wasn't trying to earn trust anymore. It had it. Now the question became, what do people do once they start worrying about the machine and start mastering it? By late 1996, something had quietly disappeared. Not arcades and not competition, expectation. For years, there had been an unwritten understanding that if a game existed in the arcade, the home version would be worse, maybe slower, maybe missing effects, maybe missing content entirely. That wasn't even controversial, that was just the deal people accepted. You paid for convenience, the arcade kept the spectacle. And for a long time, that felt completely reasonable. Arcades looked impossible. You'd walk in and everything felt brighter, smoother and louder than what you had at home. Cabinets existed to do one thing extremely well. Home consoles were trying to do everything at once. So naturally, they lost, until suddenly, they didn't. By the end of 1996, fighting games became one of the clearest signs that something had changed because fighting games expose hardware immediately. You can hide limitations in slower games, you can disguise problems in bigger worlds. Fighting games have nowhere to hide. Animation, timing, responsiveness, players feel problems instantly. That's what made this year important. People started bringing arcade games home and noticing something uncomfortable. The gap wasn't as big anymore. For a lot of people, that moment was Tekken 2. Not because it invented fighting games and not because it looked impossible. It mattered because it felt complete. Characters moved well, hits felt heavy, animation looked smooth, the music sounded cleaner than people expected. But maybe the biggest difference wasn't technical at all. You didn't run out of time. Arcades are designed around endings. You pay, you lose, you leave. Home games work differently. You stay, you improve, you experiment, you keep going. That changes things more than people realise. Fighting games stop being quick experiences and start becoming hobbies. Players learned characters instead of sampling them, discovered combinations nobody at school believed existed. That shift mattered because mastery became part of ownership, and once games become mastery, they stop competing with arcades and become something else entirely. Tekken 2 understood this. The home version wasn't trying to recreate the cabinet perfectly, it gave players reasons to stay. More modes, unlockables, more time, and players noticed. For one of the first times, people started saying something that would have sounded strange only a few years earlier. The home version might actually be better. That idea spread. Then Soul Edge arrived and pushed things again. Weapon combat, big presentation, animated openings that looked absurdly expensive at the time. Suddenly, home games weren't only competing on gameplay anymore. Now they were competing on atmosphere, collection, ownership, identity, and underneath all of this, another change was happening. Social gaming moved. People still went out, people still played in arcades, but increasingly they gathered around televisions instead. Controllers got passed around and the winner stayed on. Memory cards turned up in pockets and entire evenings disappeared. The living room slowly became the venue. That's difficult to reverse once it starts because arcades sell moments, homes sell time. And by the end of 1996, time was starting to win. Arcades weren't dying, not yet, but for the first time, they didn't feel untouchable anymore. And once players realise home can be enough, they stop expecting spectacle, they start expecting death. By the end of 1996, players had stopped being impressed by graphics alone. That sounds impossible for the mid-90s because every magazine cover looked like polygons had personally invented the future, but novelty fades quickly. Eventually, people stopped asking, how does it look? And started asking, what can I actually do? That question changed games because once developers realised players understood movement, understood cameras and were willing to learn more complicated systems, they started building games differently. Less immediate, less arcade, more mechanical. Games stopped being something you simply reacted to. Now they started asking players to think. One of the clearest examples of this shift arrived in late 1996, Armored Core. And I've always liked that Armored Core feels slightly intimidating the first time you see it. Not because of difficulty, because it looks serious. Menus, numbers, parts, configuration screens, you don't immediately feel like you're playing, you feel like you're preparing. That was unusual. For years, most games wanted you to move within seconds. Armored Core did something different. It asked, before you move, what are you bringing? That sounds small, but it changes the relationship completely. Now your machine mattered, weight mattered, weapons mattered, and energy mattered. You weren't choosing a character anymore, you were building one. And what makes this period interesting is that none of this arrived with hardware designed for it. There was still no analog sticks, no modern control standards. Developers were trying to build complex three-dimensional systems using a controller that still thought mostly in directions and buttons. So games adapted, shoulder buttons became movement, camera controls became strange, input layouts became things people memorised rather than understood. Go back now and some of these control schemes look completely unreasonable. Back then, people just learned. That's something I think gets forgotten. Players in the 90s were surprisingly patient. If a game wanted 20 minutes before it became fun, people gave it 20 minutes. If a game wanted you to understand systems, you understood the systems because complexity felt exciting, complexity felt expensive, and once players realised they enjoyed learning, developers became ambitious, simulations started appearing everywhere, customization grew, menus got larger, and games became less about finishing and more about improving. That shift changes expectations because suddenly people aren't only buying games for moments anymore, now they're buying games for ownership. You save, you set up, your versions of experience. And that idea quietly became one of the foundations of modern gaming. Progress stopped being temporary, identity moved into software, and you could feel it. Players started talking differently, not have you beaten it, but what build are you using, what strategy, what parts. That language still exists now, and looking back, 1996 feels like one of the first years where console gaming stopped trying to imitate the arcade and started trusting players to enjoy depth, because once people realised complexity can be fun, there's really no going back. And while games were becoming more personal, something else was happening too. The place people played them started changing.
Someone somewhere is trying to sell you PlayStation games on TV. Be a real sap and switch off now. Do it!
By the end of 1996, something changed that people rarely talk about because it happened quickly. Nobody announced it and nobody declared it. No executive stood on stage and explained what was happening. People just started carrying the PlayStation upstairs. That sounds small. It wasn't. Because for a long time, gaming had mostly been communal. One television, shared time, shared saves, shared arguments. You played when the room was free, handed controllers over and waited your turn. That wasn't bad either. That's just how entertainment worked. The television belonged to everybody, but the PlayStation arrived at a strange moment. Televisions were becoming more common, bedrooms were changing, and slowly, games stopped feeling tied to the family room. Now if you had enough luck, enough persistence, or parents willing to move furniture, the console started becoming yours. That changed everything, because once gaming becomes private, habits change. You stay longer, you experiment more, you stop performing for people watching, you become attached. Memory cards played a huge part in this, and it's something easy to overlook now. Saving became physical. Your progress wasn't hidden inside the machine anymore, it lived on something you owned. Tiny grey cards filled with save files, strange names, experiments, rented games that never got finished, and progress nobody else was allowed to overwrite. Suddenly, people started thinking about games differently. You didn't just play, you continued. That's a surprisingly modern idea. Games stopped feeling like events and started becoming routines. You'd come home, switch on, hear the startup sound and continue where you left off. Maybe one level, maybe 5 hours. Time started disappearing, and because games were changing too, that private space started mattering more. You couldn't really play Resident Evil properly with everyone talking. Tomb Raider felt different alone. Mechanical games demanded concentration. People stayed up later. Volume lower, CRT glow, door shut, one more save, one more attempt, one more level. That rhythm feels obvious now, but it wasn't obvious then. This is where gaming starts becoming personal. You rented games and tried to finish them before Monday. You borrowed memory cards, you developed strange rituals. Maybe one save slot stayed untouched forever. Maybe somebody in the house wasn't allowed near your progress. Maybe the machine stayed switched on because nobody trusted memory cards completely yet. And then something else changed. Ownership became identity. Not just I play games, but these are my games, my saves, my setup, my collection. That matters because collections change behaviour. You stop thinking about individual experiences and start building history. And looking back, that might be one of the quiet revolutions of the PlayStation. Not polygons, not CD audio, and not hardware. The idea that games stopped being something the family owned and became something people carried with them. Because once entertainment becomes personal, people start wanting more of it, and once people want more, they start looking further away than their local shop. By the end of 1996, PlayStation had accidentally created a new problem. People wanted games faster than the industry could deliver them. That sounds completely normal now because everybody expects global launches, countdown timers and release dates that land at exactly the same moment. Back then, that wasn't how games worked. Different regions lived in different worlds. Japan got things first, America got things earlier, Europe usually got told to be patient. And patience only works until people realise somebody else already has the thing you want. That's where importing stopped being a niche hobby and started becoming a culture. Before this, importing mostly lived in specialist corners. Enthusiasts, magazine readers, people who knew somebody who knew somebody. PlayStation changed the scale. Games started looking exciting enough that waiting started feeling painful. You'd see screenshots months early, tiny previews, Japanese box art, trade show coverage, little captions underneath saying, "coming soon." Soon meant absolutely nothing. Could be weeks, could be 6 months, could be never. And once people realised these games already existed somewhere else, waiting started feeling unfair. So players adapted. Import shops became destinations. Places that felt slightly mysterious when you walked in, shelves full of unfamiliar covers, Japanese text, higher prices, consoles running games you'd only ever seen in magazines. You'd stand there pretending to understand what you were looking at, then buy something almost entirely based on vibes. Magazines poured fuel on it, official magazines, Edge, CVG, pages full of screenshots from games nobody around you actually played yet. Reviews arrived before local releases, entire worlds appearing months before shops ever stocked them. Suddenly, players weren't discovering games when they launched, they were discovering them long before they arrived. And once you knew something exists, you started finding ways. People learned strange words, NTSC, PAL, refresh rates, converters, RGB SCART, terms children probably had no business understanding, but suddenly they mattered. Because importing games sometimes look different, sometimes faster, sometimes full screen, sometimes they just felt newer. Players started comparing versions, debating versions, wanting versions, and there was something exciting about it. Owning imported games felt different, less mainstream, like finding the future slightly earlier than everyone else. You'd take games to friends' houses and nobody had seen them, nobody even knew if they'd released locally. For a brief moment, you felt ahead. That culture became important later because once people get comfortable going around official release schedules, other things eventually follow. Modern, boot methods, alternative hardware, entire communities, but in 1996 this still felt innocent. Players weren't trying to break the systems, they were just impatient, and maybe that's one of the signs PlayStation had become something bigger. People stopped waiting for games to arrive. Now they started going looking for them, because once players realise the rest of the world is already playing, it becomes very difficult to stay local. And while players were looking further away, something much closer to home was starting to change. People were leaving the arcade. For most of gaming history, the future lived somewhere else. You went to it, you didn't own it. That's what arcades were. They weren't just places to play games, they were demonstrations. Little rooms full of impossible things, bigger screens, better sound, graphics that your home machine wasn't supposed to match. You walked in expecting to be impressed. For years, that relationship felt permanent. Arcades invented, homes adapted, that was the deal. And honestly, for a long time, nobody questioned it because arcades weren't only about technology, they were social. The noise, people watching, somebody standing behind you waiting for their turn, winning in front of strangers, losing immediately and pretending you meant to do that. The machine mattered, but the place mattered too. Then 1996 started asking an uncomfortable question. If home is close enough, why leave? Not better, not identical, just close enough. That's what changed, because by now, people had Tekken 2 at home, Ridge Racer at home, WipEout at home, but more importantly, they had time. Save files, unlimited continues, no queue, no timer, no coins disappearing every few minutes. That changes behaviour. Arcades had always controlled access. Home consoles removed the clock. You could lose 100 times and nobody asked for more money. You could learn, experiment, stay, and slowly that changed the relationship. People stopped visiting arcades to practice, they started visiting to experience. That sounds small, it isn't. Once practice moves home, ownership starts winning, and something strange happens when games become permanent. You start noticing details, learning systems, unlocking things, building memories that don't disappear after 10 minutes. Arcades never really wanted that. Arcades wanted movement, people arriving and people leaving. PlayStation quietly wanted the opposite. Stay longer, buy more, come back tomorrow. Then there was another change, multiplayer. Not online, not yet, but home multiplayer became easier. Controllers, link cables, passing turns, whole evenings disappearing, competition slowly moved, not from strangers, to friends. The living room started becoming its own venue, and this wasn't universal. Arcades still mattered. Japan especially stayed strong. Specialist hardware still looked impossible, entire genres still belonged there, but the relationship had changed. People stopped assuming the best version of gaming existed somewhere else. That's the moment that mattered, because once players stopped looking outwards, they start expecting the future to arrive at home first. And that expectation never really went away. Looking back, 1996 wasn't the year arcades died. That story is too simple. 1996 was the year arcades stopped feeling immortal. The year players realised the machine under the television wasn't trying to catch up anymore. It had joined the conversation. And for the first time, the future stayed home. By the end of 1996, it's easy to look back and assume everybody knew where things were heading. They didn't. PlayStation feels inevitable now. Back then, it absolutely wasn't. Because while Sony had momentum, the other futures still looked convincing. Nintendo looked like invention, Sega looked like expertise, Sony looked like possibility. The Nintendo 64 had arrived and immediately did things people genuinely hadn't seen before. Super Mario 64 didn't just look three-dimensional, it understood three-dimensional movement in a way almost nobody else did yet. Analog movement, camera control, space that felt natural instead of experimental. People played it and immediately understood something important. This wasn't just prettier games, this was a different language. Meanwhile, Sega had an enormous credibility. That's easy to forget now. The Saturn wasn't losing because people thought Sega couldn't make games. If anything, the opposite. Arcade heritage still mattered, fighting games still mattered, Sega looked experienced. For some players, the Saturn felt more serious, more technical, more connected to the arcade culture. And then there was Sony, not always the cleanest and not always the most advanced, but suddenly everywhere. More genres, more experiments, more developers, more weird ideas. The PlayStation didn't always feel like the best machine, it felt like the machine where things happened. That difference ended up mattering. Nintendo was defining movement, Sega was preserving mastery, Sony was building culture, and in 1996, nobody knew which future was going to win. That's important to remember, because history sometimes makes victory feel obvious. It wasn't. At the end of 1996, the race still felt alive, but something had changed. People stopped asking whether PlayStation belonged. Now they started asking whether everybody else could catch it. By the end of 1996, something had happened to the PlayStation, and almost nobody noticed it happening. That's usually how big changes work. There isn't a day where everybody agrees. Nobody stands up and announces that this is normal now. Things just quietly stop feeling unusual. And that's what happened here. The PlayStation stopped feeling new, not old or boring, just normal. That sounds less exciting than revolution, but honestly, it might be more important. Because 1994 had been about belief, 1995 had been about arrival, but 1996 became something different. It became routine. People stopped talking about whether three-dimensional games worked and just played them. People stopped asking whether discs were the future and started buying memory cards. Developers stopped building technology demonstrations and started building worlds. Players stopped renting weekends and started collecting years. That's a bigger shift than it sounds, because once something becomes ordinary, expectations appear, and expectations change industries. Nobody was impressed anymore that a game had music. Now it needed good music. Nobody cared that games were 3D. Now they had to control well. Nobody cared that the graphics looked expensive. Now the world had to mean something. The audience had grown, and it happened incredibly quickly. Look at where the PlayStation started. A company people didn't fully trust. A machine people weren't sure would survive. Games trying to prove they belonged. Then look at where 1996 ends. Survival horror becomes mainstream. Characters become icons. Players argue over versions. People carry memory cards in pockets. Arcades stop feeling untouchable. Bedrooms become game rooms. The machine changed without anybody noticing. This isn't launch energy anymore. That's culture. And maybe that's why 1996 feels so important looking back. Not because it had the biggest releases. Not because everybody suddenly became perfect. Actually, a lot of things were awkward. Controls were strange, loading could drag, hardware could complain. Nobody agreed on design rules, but people stopped caring because for the first time, the experience became bigger than the limitations. That's the moment a platform survives, when players stop thinking about technology and started attaching memories to it. PlayStation had crossed that line. It wasn't the future anymore, it was just where games happened. And that created a new problem, because once players stop being impressed, developers have to become ambitious. 1997 wouldn't ask whether PlayStation was real. 1997 would ask something much more dangerous. What happens when developers stop holding back?
The biggest selling game ever on PlayStation. Over 100 hours of the most compelling gameplay. This year's most anticipated release is Final Fantasy VII.
If you enjoyed this chapter and want to keep going, subscribe and come along for the journey. This series is following the complete history of the Sony PlayStation year by year, from 1994 all the way through to 2006 when the final PlayStation games quietly rolled off the production line. Every episode builds into one complete documentary, and the full journey is collected in the playlist on screen now. Leave a comment as well. Tell me your memories of 1996, the game that changed everything for you. The console ritual you still remember, or anything you think deserves preserving as part of this archive. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It genuinely helps support the channel, helps more people discover the series, and gives this project the best chance of making it all the way to the finish line. And a special thank you goes out to the channel members. Your helping makes the project this size possible, and giving me the time to go deeper, research further, and tell the story properly. This has been Parasine. The history continues.
You saved me!
Yeah.
That was close. Thanks, Barry.
Don't mention it. What a monster. I can't believe... What the hell is this place anyway?